The summer Eliza Hart turned 23, Black Hollow was dry enough to crack. The creek that ran along the western edge of town had pulled back to a muddy trickle, and the ground in the square had gone pale and hard, stamped flat by years of boots and wagon wheels until it was closer to stone than soil. It was the kind of heat that made people irritable in ways they wouldn't own up to later. Sharp with their children, cold with their neighbors, quick to reach for cruelty as though the temperature had burned off whatever thin layer of decency usually kept it at bay. Eliza stood in that square on a Thursday morning and felt every degree of it. She hadn't slept. She'd known this was coming since the night before, when her father had come home from Deller's saloon smelling of whiskey and bad decisions and told her, without sitting down, without removing his hat, to be ready in the morning. She'd asked what for. He'd said she knew what for. She had in fact known. What she hadn't known was how many people would come to watch. There were perhaps 40 of them, maybe more. Men who'd bought grain from her father's store, women who'd sat beside her mother in the pew before her mother died, children who'd grown up running the same dirt roads Eliza had, who now stood at their mother's hips and stared with wide, uncomplicated eyes because they were too young to understand they should pretend not to. The blacksmith, Owen Pratt, stood near the corner of the feed store with his arms crossed and his expression careful and blank. The look of a man who disapproved, but had decided disapproval wasn't worth the cost of saying so out loud. Eliza's father, Chet Hart, stood in front of her. He was not a large man, but he had a large man's certainty about him, the kind that comes from decades of being agreed with. He was 51 years old, and the frontier had carved him into something weathered and angular, and whatever softness he might once have possessed had been worked out of him so long ago that Eliza had no memory of it. "You understand what's happening," he said. It wasn't a question. "I understand," she said. "The arrangement with the Connell family is done. Warren Connell wants no further association with us, and I can't say I blame him." He said it evenly, like he was reading from a ledger. "You were married to his son for 2 years. 2 years, Eliza, and nothing to show for it." She didn't answer that. There was no answer that would have satisfied him, and she'd learned a long time ago that trying to explain herself in public only gave people more material. "Warren Connell says you're barren," her father continued. He said the word without lowering his voice. Around them, she heard a few people shift, heard the small sounds of discomfort that meant they were listening closely enough to feel something about it, even if that something wasn't going to translate into action. "I have no reason to dispute that. 2 years is long enough to know. Chet." That was Margaret Hollis, the wife of the town's only doctor, stepping forward slightly from the crowd. She was a tall woman with gray hair and a habit of speaking when others wouldn't. "Perhaps this could be done privately." "There's nothing private about a liability," Chet Hart said, and Margaret Hollis closed her mouth. Eliza looked at the ground, not because she was ashamed, or not only because of that, but because she was trying to find the part of herself that could get through the next hour without coming apart. She'd had a husband who barely spoke to her, who had grown colder and colder over 24 months until the cold was all there was, and when he'd died of fever in the 3rd winter, she had not been permitted to grieve because his family had decided she was the cause of his misery. She had moved back into her father's house and cooked his meals and cleaned his floors and said almost nothing for 8 months, and this was where it had gotten her. "I'm offering her to any man who wants a working woman," her father said, raising his voice now, addressing the crowd directly. "She's strong enough. She's not stupid, whatever else she is. But any man who takes her needs to understand what he's taking. She's had her chance at a proper match, and she couldn't hold it. She's not going to give you children. She might not give you much else either, but she'll work and she won't complain, and that's more than some men have got." Eliza's jaw tightened. She kept her eyes on the ground and breathed through her nose and thought, very clearly, "I am not going to cry in front of these people. I am not going to give them that." The square was quiet for a moment. Then someone coughed. Then a man toward the back said something to the man beside him, too low for Eliza to make out, and both of them laughed, and she felt that laugh like a hand pushed flat against her sternum. She knew most of the men in Black Hollow. She'd grown up watching them. She knew which ones were kind and which ones were simply waiting for permission not to be. She scanned the crowd without lifting her chin, just her eyes moving, and she saw nobody rushing to speak. Of course not. She almost laughed herself, except the sound that wanted to come out wasn't really laughter. A A barren woman with a failed marriage and a father who was making a spectacle of disposing of her. There wasn't a man in this town who wanted that particular situation deposited on his doorstep. "Nobody?" her father said. His voice had gone flat. More silence. She heard him sigh, the particular sigh of a man who finds the world consistently disappointing, and she understood that he was calculating his next move, which probably involved sending her to work for somebody unpleasant in exchange for whatever he could get for her labor. She'd heard him mention once that the Alderman family 3 towns over needed a housekeeper and weren't choosy about the character of the women they hired. She'd been trying not to think about what that meant. Then boots. On the hard-packed ground, deliberate and unhurried, coming from the direction of the far side of the square. She looked up. He was tall. Not dramatically so, but tall in a way that the body remembers before the mind catches up, the kind of height that makes you recalibrate the space around a person. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. His clothes were plain, work shirt, worn trousers, boots with dust baked into the leather. He had the hands of someone who used them constantly, and a stillness about his face that wasn't quite unfriendly, but wasn't exactly warm either. She didn't know him. She thought she might have seen him once, maybe at the grain merchant's, a peripheral figure, the kind of man who comes into town, conducts his business, and leaves without any part of town sticking to him. He walked directly to her father and stopped. "How much?" he said. Her father looked at him with the careful assessment of a man who knows he doesn't have leverage but is trying to appear as though he does. "Your boon," he said. "The Morrow Creek Ranch." "That's right. I heard your wife passed." Something moved through the man's face. Just a flicker. "How much?" he said again. Her father named a number. It wasn't a small number, considering what he'd just spent 10 minutes telling a crowd this woman was worth. The man, Boone, reached into his coat, counted bills without visible reaction, and held them out. Her father took them. He did not look at Eliza. Boone turned to her. Up close, his eyes were a dark gray-green, difficult to read. He looked at her for a moment with what seemed like genuine consideration, not the appraising look of a buyer examining goods, but something more like the look of a person trying to figure out what someone else actually needs. "My wagon's at the north end of the street," he said. "I'll wait for you to get your things." "I don't have much," she said. "Then it won't take long." He walked back across the square. He did not acknowledge the crowd. He did not make any speeches. He simply left, and Eliza stood there for a moment in the sudden vacuum of his departure, in the middle of 40 people who had all just watched her be handed from one stranger to another, and she thought, I don't know if that was rescue or just a different kind of ruin. She went to get her things. Her things were a canvas bag containing 2 dresses, a pair of worn work boots, a hairbrush with 3 broken tines, a small tin box that had belonged to her mother, and a book of poems she'd had since she was 12, and had read so many times that certain pages had gone soft and transparent along the edges. She packed them in 8 minutes and did not look around the room she was leaving. There was nothing in it she wanted to carry with her except what was already in the bag. Her father was not in the house when she came downstairs. She didn't go looking for him. The wagon was where Boone had said it would be, at the north end of the main street, a working wagon with a loaded bed covered in canvas, feed sacks by the look of the outlines, and what appeared to be a crate of tools. The horse hitched to it was a big roan with a calm demeanor and a scar along its left flank. Boone was checking the harness when she walked up. He straightened when he heard her coming and looked at her bag, then at her. "That everything?" "Yes." He climbed up to the bench and waited while she got herself up and settled. Then he clicked to the horse, and they moved, and Black Hollow started receding behind them, and Eliza watched it go and felt almost nothing, which surprised her. She'd lived there her whole life. She thought she ought to feel something larger. But the town shrank in the distance like it was relieved to be rid of her, and she supposed she was something like relieved to be rid of it. They rode for a while without speaking. The road north out of Black Hollow followed the edge of a long, dry ridge before descending into a valley that got greener as you went, fed by a creek that came down from the hills in a way that the drought hadn't managed to kill completely. She'd never been this far north. The country felt different here, wilder, less claimed. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked, mostly to have something to measure the silence against. 4 years, he said. "And before that?" Different places. She waited to see if he'd continue. He didn't. She looked at the side of his face, at the set of his jaw and the way he watched the road like he was expecting something to go wrong with it at any moment. I should tell you, she said, because it seemed better to say it directly than to let him arrive at it sideways. What my father said in the square about children. I don't know if it's true. My husband's family said it was, but my husband was sick most of our marriage, and I don't think anyone actually... She stopped, started over. I don't know what I am, is what I mean. I only know what I was told. He was quiet for a moment. That's not why I need help, he said. Then why? He looked at the road. 5 children, he said. Ages 3 to 12. My wife died 8 months ago, and I've been managing alone since then, and I'm not managing well. A pause. The ranch is in worse shape than I'd like to admit. The children they need someone who knows what to do with children, and I don't. Not by myself. She absorbed this. 5. Yes. All yours? All mine. Something shifted in his voice, not softness exactly, but weight. Mine and Clara's. Clara. His wife. Eliza turned that over quietly and didn't ask anything else for a while. I'm not good at... I don't have a lot of experience with children, she said eventually. I don't want to misrepresent myself. Were you honest just now? Yes. Then you're ahead of most people I deal with. She didn't know what to do with that, so she turned back to the road and watched the country change around them. The ranch was called Morrow Creek, and it showed its difficulty honestly. The main house was solid enough. 2 stories, built from good timber, the kind of construction that meant someone had put serious effort into it at some point, but the years and the recent neglect had left marks everywhere. The porch railing on the south side had come loose and been propped rather than fixed. One of the shutters on the upper window hung at an angle. The kitchen garden beside the house was mostly weeds, with a few struggling plants visible among them like survivors of something. The fencing along the near pasture needed attention in at least 3 places she could see from the wagon. Beyond the house, the land opened up. Rolling pasture, a creek line marked by cottonwoods that were still green, a barn that seemed in better repair than the house, and beyond all of it, the hills. They were beautiful hills, she noticed involuntarily, the kind that looked different every hour as the light moved across them. She noticed the children before the wagon had fully stopped. They were standing in a row on the porch, or most of them were. The oldest one, a boy, stood slightly apart with his arms crossed and an expression of comprehensive suspicion. Beside him was a girl, maybe 10, with dark braids and her father's same careful watchfulness in her face. Then a boy of about 8, who was trying very hard to look neutral and mostly achieving it. Then a girl of 5 or so who had apparently decided not to commit to any particular stance and was simply staring. And then, barely visible behind the 5-year-old's shoulder, a small set of eyes belonging to the 3-year-old, peering around like whatever came off that wagon might require rapid retreat. Eliza climbed down from the wagon. She stood in the dirt and looked at the 5 of them. These are my children, Boone said, coming around from the other side. He went through them quickly. Daniel's 12, Nora's 10, Sam's 8, Josie's 5. That's May behind Josie. Hello, Eliza said. Nobody said anything back. Daniel, the 12-year-old, looked at her the way she imagined she might look at a fence post that someone claimed was load-bearing, with the specific skepticism of a person who has been disappointed by this kind of claim before. Is she the new mama? Josie asked, directing this question to her father. She's come to help, Boone said. That's not what you said before, Josie said. Boone looked like he was working through several possible responses. Let's get inside, he said. The inside of the house was what she'd expected, and slightly worse. Not filthy, exactly. He'd been trying, but carrying the accumulated disorder of 8 months of a man managing 5 children alone while also trying to keep a ranch operational. There were dishes stacked in a way that suggested they'd been washed but never found their way back to where they belonged. The floor in the main room had been swept but not scrubbed. In the corner, a basket of mending had grown to the point of structural ambiguity. It was hard to say where the basket ended and the pile began. The curtains in the kitchen were the same ones that had been there when Clara Boone was alive, probably, and they had been cheerful once in a yellow and white check, and now were simply faded. Daniel disappeared upstairs immediately. Nora drifted to the kitchen table and sat down with the studied casualness of someone who is watching you closely and doesn't want you to know it. Sam stood near the back door as though keeping his options open. Josie followed Eliza from room to room at a distance of approximately 4 feet, saying nothing. May refused to come inside at all. Boone showed Eliza the room she'd be sleeping in, a small room off the kitchen that had probably been a storage room at some point and had been cleared out and furnished with a rope bed and a chest of drawers that was too big for the space. It was not luxurious. She set her bag on the bed and looked at the window, which faced east. "I know it's not much," he said from the doorway. "It's more than I've had in a while," she said. "I mean that honestly, not as a complaint about my circumstances." He nodded. "The children eat at 6. I can tell you where things are." "That would be helpful." She paused. "Mr. Boone?" "Riker," he said. "My name is Riker." "Riker." She tried it. It sat plainly, without decoration. "I want to say something, and I want you to hear it straight and not read anything into it beyond what I mean." He waited. "I've been told my whole life what I'm worth, and it's always been less than I thought. I'm not going to perform gratitude for being here. I'm going to do the work, and I'm going to do it honestly. And if it isn't enough, then I'll need you to tell me that directly, rather than let it build up." She looked at him steadily. "Can you do that?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "Then we understand each other." She turned back to the window and listened to his boots on the floorboards as he left. She made a mess of dinner. Not catastrophically, but badly enough that she felt it. She'd asked Boone where things were, and he'd shown her with the kind of guidance that made clear he was also not entirely certain, opening a cabinet and gesturing vaguely at its contents as though its organization was a matter of ongoing negotiation. The pantry had staples, but in unpredictable quantities. Plenty of cornmeal, almost no salt, a mysterious abundance of dried beans, and 3 different partial tins of something she couldn't identify. She found enough for a passable stew. It needed more time than she gave it, and she salted it wrong. Once not enough, once too much, landing somewhere in the muddy middle. The biscuits were acceptable, she thought, though she burned the first batch because she didn't know the stove's particular temperament. She set it all on the table and called the children. They came, in various states of reluctance. Boone came from outside with hay on his shirt. They all sat. Eliza served the stew from the pot and put the biscuits in the center of the table. There was a moment where everyone looked at the food. "It's not right," Daniel said. Not meanly, just factually. Mama's stew was thicker. "Dan," Boone said, "I'm not trying to make trouble. I'm just saying it's not the same." "Nothing's going to be the same," Nora said, and something in her voice made the table go quiet for a moment. "I know," Eliza said. She looked at Daniel directly. "I don't know how your mother made it. I can try to learn, if someone will show me. But I'm not her, and I'm not trying to be her, and I think it's better if we're all honest about that from the beginning." Daniel stared at her. He had the focused, measuring quality of a child who has been forced to grow up faster than he should have, and resents it at a level he can't entirely articulate. "It's fine," Josie said, with the supreme confidence of a 5-year-old who has not yet developed the social mechanisms that make lying about food feel complicated. "I like it." "Thank you," Eliza said. May ate half her biscuit and fell asleep at the table before the meal was done, leaning sideways until she was nearly horizontal. Boone caught her before she slid off the bench, lifted her with the practiced ease of someone who has done this many times, and took her to bed. When he came back, the table was quieter, and the stew was mostly gone, which Eliza decided to take as a modest success. She lay awake that night for a long time. The house settled around her with the sounds of an unfamiliar place, different creaks, different silences. The particular acoustics of rooms she hadn't learned yet. She could hear, faintly, the sound of the creek at the edge of the property, an owl somewhere in the cottonwoods, the breathing of the ranch. She thought about her father counting those bills. She thought about the way he hadn't looked at her, and the way the crowd had been so quiet, and the way that Margaret Hollis had tried, briefly, and then hadn't. She thought about Daniel's face across the dinner table, about Nora's voice saying nothing's going to be the same, with a grief in it so solid it was almost a physical thing. These children had lost their mother. They hadn't asked for a replacement. They hadn't asked for any of this, any more than she had, and she understood that what she was walking into wasn't a household that needed her. It was a household that needed something it couldn't have back, and she was the thing standing in the place where that something used to be. That was a hard thing to sit with, but she'd sat with hard things before. She was, as her father had said, inadvertently giving her the only thing she'd take from him, not stupid. And she was not going to lie in this unfamiliar room and tell herself a story about how this was going to be easy, because she'd learned over 23 years that stories about easy things were the ones that hurt the most when the truth arrived. So she lay there and let herself look at it plainly. 5 children who didn't trust her. A man she didn't know, who had said perhaps 30 sentences to her in total, and who was carrying something he hadn't told her the full shape of yet. A ranch that was struggling in ways she hadn't yet mapped. A past that would follow her into any room she walked into in this county for years, because that was the nature of small places. They kept records. And what she had against all of that, the fact that she was here, the fact that she was willing, the fact that she had lived through being nobody's priority for so long that she had discovered in the grinding process of it something like the actual bottom of herself, and found to her own surprise that it was sturdier than she'd expected. She turned onto her side and looked at the east-facing window. Tomorrow, she'd learn the stove. The first week was the kind of difficult that announces itself honestly and gets on with it. She burned 2 more things. She put the laundry in the wrong order and had to do half of it over. She couldn't find the mending basket until Nora, wordlessly, pointed at it with one finger and then went back to her book. She made cornbread that Sam ate 3 pieces of, and then, with visible reluctance, told her it was good, in the tone of a person for whom this admission has cost something. The children maintained their positions. Daniel stayed at the perimeter, civil when addressed, never volunteering anything, watching her with those careful eyes that were too old for his face. Nora was quieter and harder to read. She would sit in the same room as Eliza and say almost nothing, but she didn't leave, which Eliza thought might be its own kind of language. Sam was the most straightforward of the 3 older ones. He wanted to be outside. He wanted to work. And he was in a constant low-level negotiation with Boone about how much responsibility he was old enough for. Josie chattered without apparent concern for whether anyone was listening, which Eliza found unexpectedly restoring. May remained the problem. Not a problem exactly. She wasn't difficult, she wasn't defiant. She simply refused to be in the same room as Eliza for any length of time. If Eliza came into the kitchen, May went out the back door. If Eliza sat on the porch, May materialized briefly in the doorway, registered Eliza's presence, and disappeared back inside. She was 3 years old and had developed an avoidance system of impressive sophistication. She was closest to Clara, Boone told her when she mentioned it. They were in the kitchen after the children were in bed, and he was at the table with the ranch account spread in front of him, and Eliza was trying to figure out how much of what remained in the pantry could reasonably be called a weekly food supply. She doesn't have the words for it. She just knows there's a woman in the house who isn't her mother. I know, Eliza said. I'm not going to push her. I appreciate that. She looked at the accounts from across the room without meaning to, and what she could read of them from that distance told a story she recognized. Numbers that didn't quite add up, shortfalls being carried forward month to month, the particular arithmetic of a life that is costing more than it's producing. Is the ranch in trouble? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. It's been a hard year. That's not what I asked. He looked up at her. She waited. He looked back at the accounts. We're managing, he said. You hired me to be honest with you. I hired you to help with the children. The children live on this ranch, she said. If the ranch fails, that's not just your problem. That landed somewhere. She could see it in the slight shift of his posture. The cattle sale in the fall should cover the main debts, he said, if the pasture holds, if the drought doesn't get worse. He said it with the flat precision of a man who has run these calculations so many times they've worn grooves in him. There's a note on the property from the bank in Linfield. It's current, but barely. How much margin? He told her. She did the math in her head. That's thin, she said. I know that. All right, she said. Then we don't waste anything. He looked at her. That's your response? What would you prefer? I've been poor before. Being poor carefully is better than being poor carelessly. She went back to the pantry inventory. I want to put in a kitchen garden, What I see out there now is barely functioning. The soil's hard. I can work hard soil. He watched her for a moment. She could feel it without looking. You don't have to fix everything, he said. It sounded like it cost him something to say it. I'm not trying to fix everything, she said. I'm trying to fix the kitchen garden, one thing at a time. She heard what might have been a sound of amusement from the direction of the table, low and brief, gone so quickly she couldn't be certain. She didn't look up, but she noted it. Mag. At the end of the second week, Josie got sick. It started as what everyone hoped was a passing thing. She was feverish one evening, wouldn't eat her supper, and went to bed early without complaint, which should have been the first real warning sign, because Josie never went anywhere without generating some comment about it. By midnight, the fever had climbed to something that made Eliza's skin go cold when she pressed her palm to the girl's forehead. She'd been awake already. She didn't sleep well in unfamiliar places, hadn't since she was a child herself. She heard Josie making small sounds through the thin wall between their rooms and got up without thinking about it. Boone was in the hallway when she came out, barefoot, in the dark. He'd heard it too. How bad? He asked. She went past him into Josie's room and put her hand on the girl's forehead. Josie's eyes opened halfway and looked at her without focus. Bad enough, she said. I need cloths and cold water. Is there a doctor in Black Hollow? Hollis, yes, but it's 2 hours each way. She did the calculation. Start the water cold. Keep the cloths coming. I need to bring the fever down before morning. She didn't remember deciding to be the one who handled it. It simply happened. Boone went for water. She stayed with Josie, and the arrangement established itself without discussion. The next several hours were the kind of work that empties a person out. Cool cloths replaced methodically. Josie roused to drink water in small sips. The fever checked and checked and checked again. The whole process repeated in the lamplight while the rest of the house slept. Boone stayed. He brought the water. He sat in the corner chair and watched, and at some point around 3 a.m, when the fever finally, grudgingly, started to turn, he said, You know what you're doing. I've done this before, she said. She was replacing a cloth on Josie's forehead. The girl had stopped making sounds and gone into real sleep, not the restless, shallow sleep of a climbing fever, but something deeper and genuine. My mother was sick for a long time when I was young. There wasn't always a doctor. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him. His face in the lamplight was tired and something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. Some quality of a person who has been holding things together for so long, they've almost forgotten what it feels like to put something down. She got better, Eliza said. Eventually. Not that time, but she got better. She wrung out the cloth. Josie's going to be all right. The fever's dropping. He let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. I know it's not, he started. Don't, she said. He stopped. You don't have to thank me, she said. Just let me keep watch for the rest of the night and go get some sleep because one of us needs to be functional tomorrow. He stood. He looked at Josie. He looked at Eliza. He started again, then seemed to think better of it. Go, she said, not unkindly. He went. She sat through the rest of the night with Josie, listening to the house settle and the creek run and the slow improvement of the girl's breathing. She was tired in a way that went all the way through her, but it wasn't the tired of despair. It was the tired of having done something that needed doing. In the morning, Josie woke up and asked for biscuits, which Eliza took as a diagnosis. She also woke up and reached for Eliza's hand, which she held for a moment without comment, before losing interest and asking again about the biscuits. Eliza made the biscuits. She didn't cry until she was outside, briefly, by the kitchen garden, with her back to the house. It was a short cry, and quiet, and it was for too many things to name in order, and she was done with it by the time she heard the back door open behind her. It was Nora. Nora stood on the step and looked at her. Something in the older girl's face had shifted in a way that was subtle enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. The biscuits are ready, Nora said. Thank you, Eliza said. Josie wants you to bring them. Eliza wiped her face with the back of her hand and turned toward the house. Nora held the door open for her. She hadn't done that before. It was such a small thing, the holding open of a door, and Eliza Hart walked through it into the kitchen where 5 children were waiting, and she thought very quietly, in the place where she kept things that were true. Something just changed. She didn't know yet what it was, but she filed it alongside the other things she was keeping track of. The sound Riker Boone had made that might have been amusement, the way Josie had held her hand, the steady presence of this land and its hills and its creek and its stubborn, struggling, not yet beaten garden that she intended to fix one row at a time. She filed it, and she kept going. The kitchen garden took her 3 weeks of mornings to get right, and even then right was a generous word for what she'd managed. The soil was the problem. It had been neglected long enough that it had compacted into something closer to hardpan than earth, the kind of ground that doesn't yield to a hoe so much as it argues with one. She'd gone out the first morning before anyone else was awake, found the tools in the shed, and started working. By the time Riker came out of the barn at 6:30, she'd cleared maybe 4 feet of bed and turned over what looked like the aftermath of a long argument. He stood at the shed corner and looked at what she'd done. "That's going to take a while," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I could help after the cattle check." "You have enough to do." He looked like he was going to argue, then decided against it. She appreciated that. It was Nora who showed up 2 mornings later, unprompted, with the smaller hoe from behind the door. She didn't say anything, just started on the row beside Eliza's, and they worked in silence for an hour before the younger children needed breakfast. Eliza didn't make anything of it out loud. She understood instinctively that Nora was not the kind of person who responded well to being noticed doing something kind. The noticing would make her retreat from it. So Eliza just worked her row and let Nora work hers and let the morning be what it was. It became a pattern. Not every morning, but enough mornings. Nora would appear or she wouldn't, and either way the work continued, and by the end of those 3 weeks, Eliza had a functioning plot. 3 rows of beans, 2 of squash, a struggling section of root vegetables that she was less certain about, and a row of herbs along the fence that she'd started from seeds she'd found in a tin in the back of the pantry, probably Clara Boone's, probably several years old, but still worth trying. The first seedling came up on a Tuesday. It was barely visible, a thin green hook pushing up through the dark soil, absurdly small and defiant. She crouched down and looked at it for longer than was strictly necessary. Josie, who had taken to following her around in the garden since her recovery, crouched beside her and looked too. "What is it?" "I think it's a bean," Eliza said. "It's little." "It was little yesterday. It'll be less little tomorrow." Josie considered this with the seriousness she applied to most information. "I want to water it." "Then get the small can. Don't drown it." Josie went for the can with a sense of purpose that made her look briefly like a general who has just received useful intelligence. Eliza stayed crouched in the dirt and looked at the seedling and let herself feel for a moment something uncomplicated. She hadn't felt a lot of uncomplicated things lately. Most of what she felt had several layers to it. The relief of being here tangled up with the uncertainty of what here actually meant. The warmth she was beginning to feel toward these children, complicated by the knowledge that it made her more vulnerable. The strange growing comfort of Riker Boone's presence cut through with the awareness that she didn't fully know him, and he didn't fully know her, and they were sharing a house and a situation that neither of them had planned for. But a seedling in the morning, that was just good. She stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and went to help Josie manage the watering can. The months that followed the kitchen garden moved with the rhythm of the ranch. Not clean, not easy, marked by the accumulated small failures and occasional unexpected successes that constitute a life being actually lived rather than imagined. Eliza burned things less. She learned the stove's personality. It ran hot on the left side and took longer on the right, and if you didn't watch the back burner, it would turn a simmer into a scorch in the time it took to answer a child's question. She learned that May ate better if her food wasn't touching anything else on the plate, a discovery she made by accident and filed carefully. She learned that Sam would do any chore asked of him without complaint if you explained why it mattered, and would drag his feet indefinitely if you simply told him to do it. She learned that Riker ate too fast when he was worried about something, barely tasting the food, working through it like fuel rather than a meal. That was how she tracked the state of the ranch more reliably than the numbers could tell her. Not by the accounts he still kept from her mostly, but by how long dinner took him. He ate fast a lot that summer. Daniel remained the hardest. Not hostile, exactly. He'd gotten past the open suspicion of those first weeks and arrived somewhere more complicated, a watchful neutrality that was harder to navigate than outright opposition. He did his work. He was polite in the clipped, formal way of a 12-year-old who has decided that politeness requires nothing further from him. He never asked her for anything if he could avoid it, but he watched her. She felt it constantly, that careful observation, and she didn't know what he was looking for. She found out in September, when he broke his arm. He'd been on the roof of the barn. She never got the full story, only fragments, trying to fix something with the weather vane that Riker had been meaning to get to. He fell from the lower section, not far enough to be dangerous in most circumstances, but he landed wrong on the extended arm, and she heard the sound from the kitchen garden, and it was a sound that needed no interpretation. She got to him before Riker did. He was sitting up in the dirt, holding the arm against his chest, and his face had gone the particular color of someone dealing with serious pain by refusing to acknowledge it, gray pale and absolutely still. "Let me see," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not fine. Let me see the arm." He looked at her. Something moved through his face that she didn't have a name for yet. Then he shifted the arm slightly toward her, holding it out with the stiffness of someone who has decided to trust something they're not certain about. She looked at it carefully without touching it. The angle was wrong, not catastrophically, but wrong. "It's broken," she said. "We need to splint it and get you to Dr. Hollis." "I know it's broken," he said tightly. "Then why did you tell me you were fine?" He didn't answer that. She went for the splinting materials. She had to improvise. Flat pieces of wood from the scrap pile by the barn, torn strips from an old shirt she'd been saving for rag use. Her hands were steady. She'd learned that from her mother's illness, too. Your hands have to be steady even when the rest of you isn't. He watched her work with the same quality of attention he'd always watched her, but from closer, and she could see something shifting in it. She wrapped the splint carefully and tied it without pulling too tight, and when she was done, she sat back and looked at him. "I'm going to tell your father," she said. "He's going to want to take you to Hollis today." "He's going to be angry," Daniel said, "about the arm. About the roof. He told me not to go up there." She considered this. "That's between you and him," she said. "I'm not going to manage that for you." He looked at her. "Most adults lie about that," he said. "They say they won't say anything, and then they do." "I'm not saying I won't tell him what happened. I'm saying I won't tell him anything beyond what happened, and I won't stand around adding to it." She held his gaze. "You broke your arm. That's the main fact." He was quiet for a moment. The barn cat, which had appeared from somewhere and stationed itself nearby with the opportunistic interest cats bring to human crises, blinked once and looked away. "My mother used to splint things," Daniel said. It came out quietly, almost like he hadn't meant to say it. "Did she?" Eliza said. She kept her voice steady. "She said a woman on a ranch needs to know how to handle injuries because you can't always wait for a doctor." He was looking at the splint. "She splinted Sam's finger when he got it caught in the fence gate. She did mine once too, a toe I broke jumping from the hayloft when I was 8. "She sounds like she knew what she was doing," Eliza said. "She knew everything," he said. And then, with a kind of helpless honesty that only comes out when pain has worn down the usual guards, I keep waiting for you to not know something important, to show me the part where you don't actually know what you're doing, because then at least I'd understand why she's not here." The logic of it made a terrible kind of sense. Eliza sat with it for a moment. "I don't know everything your mother knew," she said. "I never will. I don't know this land the way she did, or these children the way she did, or what she would have done differently than me in any given situation." She paused. "But I know how to splint a broken arm, and I know that you're hurting in about 15 ways right now, and only one of them is the arm." She stood up. "Let me go get your father." Daniel didn't say anything, but when she walked past him toward the barn, he said, very quietly, to her back, "Thank you." She kept walking, but she heard it, and she kept it. Riker took Daniel to see Dr. Hollis in Linfield, the nearer option than Black Hollow, for which Eliza was quietly grateful. And they came back in the late afternoon with Daniel's arm properly set and splinted, and Daniel in the determined good humor of someone who has been through an unpleasant experience and come out the other side with some dignity intact. He ate 2 full bowls of the soup she'd had going all day and said it was good without being asked, which she suspected was connected more to the arm than to the soup, but she accepted it at face value. That night, after the children were in bed, Riker came and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he didn't particularly seem to want and looked at her across the table. "He told me you kept your head," he said. "It wasn't complicated." He was scared. He doesn't scare easily. He hit it well, she said. Most of it. Riker turned the cup in his hands. He had a habit of doing that when he was working through something. The turning of objects between his palms, a physical manifestation of thought. He told me about what you said, Riker said. About his mother. I meant it, she said. I'm not trying to replace her. I know. He set the cup down. I'm trying to figure out what you're doing then. What do you mean? I mean, you're doing more than I hired you for. The garden, the splinting, the nights with Josie. You don't have to do any of that. I know I don't have to, she said. They're here, and they need things, and I can provide some of those things. It's not nothing, he said. I want you to know I see it. She looked at him steadily. The lamplight made the kitchen feel smaller and warmer than it was. And Riker Boone across the table from her with his tired face and his turned-down cup looked like a man who was very slowly learning that putting things down might not actually break him. I grew up feeling like I was invisible, she said. I know what it costs to be seen. I know what it's worth. She folded her hands on the table. You paid money for me in a town square, and I haven't forgotten that, and I'm not going to pretend the whole thing was dignified. But you also didn't haggle, and you didn't ask my father any questions about me, and when I told you I expected honesty from you, you said yes without making a speech about it. She paused. Those aren't small things to a person who hasn't had them. Boom. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the creek was doing what it always did. The small, consistent sound of it that she'd come to find steadying. I wasn't looking for a wife, he said. It wasn't a rebuke. It was just the plain fact of it, offered without apology. I know, she said. I wasn't looking for a husband. She met his eyes. But I was looking for a place where I wasn't nothing. And this... She glanced toward the dark hallway where the children slept. This has turned into something. I didn't plan it. It just happened. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his cup and drank the rest of the coffee and stood. I'm glad you're here, he said, simply, like it was just a fact he'd arrived at and saw no reason not to say out loud. Good night, Riker, she said. He went to bed. She sat at the table for another half hour, listening to the creek, before she did the same. October came in cold and clear, and with it came the shift that Eliza had sensed approaching without being able to name. It arrived not in a single moment, but in a series of them, small and unheroic, accumulating like the interest on a debt you've been paying down so slowly you almost don't notice the balance changing. Josie started calling her mama first. She said it one morning without preamble, without apparent consciousness of what she was doing, just looked up from the biscuit she was eating and said, Mama, can I have the butter? And kept eating. Eliza had passed the butter without commenting on it, her heart doing something complicated in her chest, and Josie had moved on to discussing whether the barn cat had eaten a mouse the previous night, and what that meant for the mice who lived by the woodpile. May was next, and that one took her apart entirely. May had been thawing, slowly, in the way of very young children who don't have the vocabulary to manage their feelings, so they manage them through proximity, getting a little closer, then retreating slightly, then a little closer again, like a creature testing the temperature of something before committing. She had started appearing in the kitchen when Eliza was cooking, not engaging, just being there. She had started sleeping with the barn cat rather than by herself, which wasn't related to Eliza, but represented a general move toward company. She had one afternoon climbed onto the porch railing beside Eliza and sat there in silence for 20 minutes while Eliza mended a shirt. Then one morning in the second week of October, Eliza was in the kitchen garden doing the late harvest, pulling what could still be pulled before the first frost came, which could be any day now. And she heard the back door. She looked up. May was standing on the step in her nightgown, barefoot, which was not appropriate weather-wise, with her hair in the tangles of sleep and her expression carrying that particular seriousness that small children bring to the most unexpected moments. She walked down the step and across the yard and stopped in front of Eliza. Mama, she said, not as a question, as an announcement. Eliza went completely still. May reached out and put her small hand on Eliza's dirt-covered forearm. Mama, she said again, apparently satisfied with the word and wanting to confirm its establishment. Eliza set down the squash she'd been holding. She crouched in the dirt in front of May, and May looked at her with those grave, dark eyes that had spent so long avoiding her, and Eliza thought, she chose this. She decided. Not because Eliza had earned it by any particular measure, but because May was 3 years old and the world was large and confusing and cold in the mornings, and she had made a choice about who she was going to move toward. "You're going to get frost on your feet," Eliza said. "No," May said, with the confidence of someone who has not personally experienced frostbite and therefore does not believe in it. "Come here," Eliza said, and picked her up, which May permitted with the cooperative gravity of someone who has decided to allow this. And Eliza held this small child in the kitchen garden in the October morning and breathed slowly until she was sure she could speak normally. "Let's go get your shoes," she said. "And breakfast," May said. "And breakfast," Eliza agreed. She carried her inside. Nora was already in the kitchen, starting the fire, and looked at them when they came in, at May's arms around Eliza's neck, at Eliza's face, which she probably wasn't managing as carefully as she usually did. Nora looked for a moment, and then she looked at the fire she was building and said nothing, and Eliza understood that this was Nora's way of respecting something. Sam was the most practical about it, as was consistent with his character. He started calling her Mama around the same time, and when Eliza raised an eyebrow the first time he did it, he shrugged and said, "It's shorter than Miss Eliza," which was such a Sam explanation that she accepted it completely. Daniel took until November. He didn't make it an occasion. He was sitting at the table doing his arithmetic. He was diligent about schoolwork in the methodical, joyless way of a child who understands its necessity but doesn't particularly love it. And he needed help with a problem, and he looked up and said, "Mama, what's 14% of 340? And then looked back at his paper waiting for the answer. She gave him the answer. He wrote it down. He didn't look up again. She went back to the dishes she'd been washing and did not let herself react in any visible way, because she understood that making it visible would make it a thing he'd have to contend with, and what he needed it to be was just a thing he'd decided. But that night, after the children were in bed and Riker was in the barn doing something with a harness, she sat at the kitchen table and laid her arms flat on the surface and rested her forehead on them, just for a minute, and let herself feel the full, complicated weight of it. These 5 children who were not hers, and were becoming hers in the particular way that has nothing to do with blood and everything to do with something harder to name. What it costs. What it gives you back. She heard Riker come in the back door, heard him stop when he saw her. "Eliza." "I'm fine," she said without lifting her head. A pause. Then the sound of him pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down. "Daniel called me Mama today," she said, muffled by her own arms. Another pause. "I know," Riker said. "He told me he was going to." She lifted her head. "He told you first?" "He wanted to know if I minded." Something in Riker's voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Careful and full at the same time, like a man handling something he's afraid of dropping. "I told him it was his choice to make." "What did he say?" "He said he'd been watching you since the beginning, trying to figure out if you were going to leave." Riker looked at her directly. "He said he watched you with Josie when she was sick, and with his arm, and with the garden, and he decided you weren't the kind of person who leaves." Eliza looked at the table. "He's 12, she said. "He is," Riker said. "He's also not wrong. Not—" She didn't respond to that right away. The fire was low and needed banking for the night, and the kitchen was getting cold at the edges the way it did on November evenings, and outside the first real hint of winter was in the air. "I was married for 2 years and never felt like I had a home," she said. "Not once. And now I've been here 5 months and She stopped. "I don't know how to explain what that is." "You don't have to explain it," Riker said. "I know I don't have to. I'm trying to, for myself." He looked at her. In 5 months she had learned his silences. The closed ones, that meant he'd finished with a topic, and the open ones, that meant he was listening in the full sense of the word. This was the open kind. "My husband's family told me I wasn't capable of love," she said. "That's what Barren meant to them. Not just the absence of children, but the absence of whatever a woman needs to make children worth having. Like I was missing something essential." She looked up at Riker. "I believed them for a while. That's the part I'm most ashamed of, that I let them convince me." "What convinced you otherwise?" Riker asked. She almost laughed. "Josie asking for the butter," she said. "May in the garden this morning. She looked at the hallway. A 12-year-old who asked his father for permission to call me by a name. Riker was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, I have never once thought you were missing anything." She looked at him steadily. He held her gaze with the same steadiness he held most things. Not dramatically, just fully, with the particular solidity of a man who means what he says precisely because he says so little. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He pushed back from the table and went to bank the fire, and she sat for a moment longer before getting up to help. The things that were building between them didn't have a name yet. She didn't try to give them one. November brought cold that settled in to stay, and with the cold came the kind of ranch work that made everything harder. Frozen water troughs in the morning, cattle that needed more feed when the pasture grass went brown and stiff, a dozen small systems that functioned adequately in warmth and required constant management in the frost. Riker was outside before dawn most days and didn't come in until well after dark, and the hours between were full in the way that ranch winters are full. Not spectacular, just relentless. Eliza managed the house and the children and the cooking and what she could of the indoor chores, and when there was a gap, she went outside and worked beside him, because 4 hands were better than 2, and also because she'd found that she didn't like the feeling of being inside while he was outside managing everything alone. It felt wrong, the way certain imbalances feel wrong before you can articulate why. He noticed. "You don't have to be out here," he said one morning, when she showed up at the barn as he was breaking ice on the water trough. "I know," she said. "Give me the other axe." He gave her the other axe. They worked in silence for a while. The sound of the axes on ice clean and sharp in the cold air. Their breath came in small clouds. The cattle moved around them with the patient commentary of animals that understand winter is a shared inconvenience. "Sam's been asking if he can help with the cattle check," she said. "He's 8. He's 8 and capable and bored and feels left out," she said. "I'm not telling you how to run things. I'm telling you what I see." Riker was quiet for a moment. His mother didn't want him around the cattle yet. "His mother isn't here," Eliza said. It came out more directly than she intended. She looked at him. "I'm sorry." That was bluntly said. "No," he said. "It's true." He hit the ice once more, hard. "I'll take him tomorrow." "He'll be in the barn before you're up," she said. And Sam was, in fact, waiting at the barn door the next morning in his heaviest coat with his hat pulled down over his ears, looking like a person who has been awake for some time out of sheer anticipation. Riker came out of the house and found him there, and looked at him for a moment and then said, "Come on then," and Sam fell into step beside him, like he'd been doing it all his life. Eliza watched from the kitchen window. Nora appeared at her shoulder, also watching. "He's wanted that for months," Nora said. "I know. Papa didn't see it." "He sees a lot of things," Eliza said. "He's also been carrying everything alone. Things get missed." Nora was quiet for a moment, then, "He's different now." "How?" "He comes home and stays," Nora said. "Before, he'd come in for dinner and then go back out. Even after dark, I think being in the house was—" She stopped. "After Mama died, the house felt wrong. I think he couldn't stand it." Eliza held that. "What about now?" she asked carefully. Nora looked at her with her father's directness. "Now he comes home," she said, like it was self-explanatory. And perhaps it was. December settled the question of whether Eliza belonged here without asking anyone's opinion. It happened the way belonging usually does. Not in a moment, but in the accumulation of moments until one day you look up and realize the shape of the place has changed around you to fit the shape of you. Or you've changed to fit it, and you can no longer tell from the inside which way the adjustment went. She knew the names of the cattle. She knew which fence posts were holding and which were going to need attention come spring. She knew that the root cellar was on the north side and that the potatoes kept better if they were not stacked more than 3 layers deep. She knew that May had nightmares on Tuesdays specifically, a thing she'd noticed before Riker had, and that the way to settle her was to sit in the dark at the edge of the bed and hum, nothing in particular, just the low sound of presence. She knew that Riker Boone took his coffee too hot and couldn't drink it until it had been sitting for 4 minutes, and that he always read the last page of a thing before committing to reading it from the beginning, and that he laughed most easily at things that surprised him, that his sense of humor, like the man himself, rewarded patience. And she knew, had known for some time, in the quiet way of knowledge that arrives before you're ready to name it, that something had changed in how he looked at her. Not dramatically, nothing Riker Boone did was dramatic, but there was a quality to his attention that had shifted, a quality of care that had moved past the practical and into something else, something neither of them had yet done anything about. She wasn't in a hurry. She'd lived most of her life in situations where wanting things too openly was how you got them taken away. And there was something in the not yet of it that felt itself like a kind of richness. The knowledge that something was there and would, in its own time, be said. December came and went, and January came in harder than December, and February was the worst. And through all of it, Morrow Creek Ranch continued its imperfect, costly, authentic life. Children fed and argued and growing, the land endured, the creek ran under its skim of ice, and two people who had not planned on any of this found themselves, most mornings, working side by side in the cold and not minding it. That was, Eliza thought, maybe what belonging actually felt like. Not a feeling, not a moment, just the morning work, and the person beside you in it, and the fact that you wouldn't trade either one. Spring came to Morrow Creek the way it always did in that country. Not gently, not all at once, but in a long negotiation between winter and warmth that left the land looking unsure of itself for weeks before it finally committed. The creek rose with the snowmelt from the hills, running brown and loud through March, before settling back into its usual voice. The pasture grass came in thin at first, then thicker, and the cattle moved differently in it, with an ease that was almost audible, the particular relief of animals that have been fed on stored grain all winter and can finally eat the ground itself again. Eliza noticed the change in the children, too. They expanded in spring the way all children do, spending more hours outside, louder, harder to settle at the end of the day. May had taken to following the barn cat on its hunting expeditions with the focused dedication of a naturalist, reporting her findings at dinner with a seriousness that made Sam press his lips together, trying not to laugh. Josie had developed opinions about which flowers were acceptable to pick, and which needed to stay in the ground for reasons she explained at length and that no one entirely followed. Sam and Riker had fallen into a real working rhythm together out on the cattle pasture. Eliza could see it in the way Sam came to dinner, carrying himself slightly differently than he had in the fall, with the quiet pride of a boy who has been trusted with real work and has not let anyone down. Daniel, who was 13 now, had become a different kind of difficult than he'd been at the beginning. He was not hostile. That had been gone since the arm, since November, since the morning he'd come down for breakfast and said, "Mama, the south fence has a post down," with the matter-of-fact reliability of someone who has decided to be part of something. His difficulty now was the ordinary difficulty of a boy at the edge of adolescence, moody and oscillating, magnificent in his capability one day, and genuinely useless the next. Eliza managed it without drama because she understood, from the inside, the particular disorientation of being between versions of yourself. Nora was 12 and had quietly become the person Eliza trusted most in the house. Not because she was obedient, she wasn't, especially when she disagreed with something, but because she was honest in the particular way that some people are honest, as a matter of character rather than convenience. If the bread was wrong, Nora said so and explained why. If one of the younger children was upset about something they hadn't said at dinner, Nora appeared at Eliza's elbow and told her. If Riker was worrying about something, Nora knew it before anyone else and said nothing to anyone, which was its own kind of honesty. It was Nora who told her, on a Thursday in late March, that there was a supply run needed in Black Hollow. "Papa was going to go last week, but the fence work," Nora said. "We're almost out of salt. And May needs new boots. She's been wearing the left one split along the toe for 2 weeks." "I know," Eliza said. She'd been aware of the boot situation and had been putting off the particular calculation that a trip to Black Hollow required. "I'll go." Papa could go. Papa has the fence and the spring cattle check and that issue with the north pasture drainage. I can drive a wagon. Nora looked at her with her particular directness. "It's been 7 months since you left," she said. "People there will—" "I know what people there will do," Eliza said. "That's not a reason to avoid them indefinitely." It wasn't bravery exactly. It was more like the decision that certain things need to be walked through rather than around, because the going around costs more in the long run. The constant adjustment of your route, the accumulation of alternative paths that all communicate the same thing, that you are afraid of the original road. She was not willing to spend her life afraid of Black Hollow. She told Riker that evening that she was going into town in the morning. He looked at her. I was planning to go next week. Next week you have the Harmon brothers coming about the fence line, she said. The salt can't wait another week, and neither can May's boots. I can go in a few days. Riker, he stopped. I know why you want to be the one to go, she said. I understand it, and I appreciate it. But I'm not going to need you to run interference in Black Hollow for the rest of my life. And the sooner I go, the sooner it's done. He looked at the table. He turned his coffee cup once. Then he looked at her. Take the good wagon, he said. The bay horse, not the roan. She's been favoring the left foreleg. All right. And he seemed to be working through something. Don't let anyone say anything to you that you have to stand still for. You don't have to stand still. I know, she said. I mean it. Whatever arrangement brought you here, that was 7 months ago. You're not... He stopped, started over. You're my wife, whatever else this is. If anyone treats you like something less, they're wrong. She looked at him for a moment. They had not, in 7 months, given formal name to what they were, and she had not pushed for it because she was still learning the shape of him, and she suspected he was still learning hers. And the children called her Mama, and the ranch ran as it ran, and there was a quality to the daily life of it that felt more married than her actual marriage had. But he had not said the word out loud before. She noted it, turned it over, set it where she could look at it later. I'll be back before dinner, she said. She left at first light with the supply list and money from the household account that Riker had started consulting her on in February, after the conversation about the kitchen garden finances that had led, gradually, to him moving the account book to the kitchen table rather than keeping it in the office. She drove the bay horse, who was steady on the road, and she watched the country move past her in the spring morning. The hills still winter-brown at the top but greening at the base, the sky a pale, clean blue. The particular smell of snowmelt and mud and new grass that meant March in this valley. She thought driving, about what it meant to go back to a place that had decided what you were worth and then been wrong about it. She wasn't angry, exactly. She'd spent enough energy on the anger in the months after the square, the hot sleepless nights of it, the replaying of her father's voice saying liability, the image of Margaret Hollis stepping forward and then stepping back. The anger had been real, and she'd let herself feel it fully, privately, without performing it for anyone, and it had gradually shifted into something cooler and more useful, a clear-eyed understanding of exactly who those people were and what weight their opinions deserved, which was not much. She was clear on that. But knowing something in your mind and knowing it in your body are different things, and she was aware as Black Hollow appeared on the horizon that her jaw had tightened and her shoulders had come up, and she made a deliberate effort to release both. Black Hollow. In late March was Black Hollow in any season. The same buildings, the same dust that was now mud in the center of the main street, the same collection of faces that made up a small frontier town. Some of them recognizable to her, and some not, because 7 months felt like longer and shorter simultaneously. She pulled up at the supply store, tied the bay horse, went in. Frank Elders ran the supply store. He'd been running it since before she could remember, a broad man with a full beard and a transaction-focused personality that had always made him easier to deal with than most of the town, because he genuinely did not care about your personal life, as long as you had money and knew what you needed. Mrs. Boone, he said, which stopped her briefly in the door. Nobody had called her that before. She wasn't sure if she'd expected it and was surprised by how it landed, or if she simply hadn't thought about it at all. Haven't seen you in town in a while. The ranch keeps busy, she said. She gave him the list. He went through it efficiently, pulling items from shelves, noting what he'd need to bring from the back. She paid attention to prices and quantities and let herself be simply a woman doing her household shopping, which was in fact what she was. She was nearly done when she heard the voice. Well, Chet Hart's daughter. She turned. Agnes Connell stood near the bolt fabric display, the mother of her dead husband, the woman who had spent 2 years of Eliza's marriage treating her like a guest who'd overstayed. She was a thin woman with a precise posture and eyes that had the quality of something that has decided things and doesn't revisit them. She was with another woman, Dorothea Price, whose husband ran the mill and who had been in the square that August morning, watching. Eliza looked at Agnes Connell and felt the old constriction in her chest and then felt at ease. Not because Agnes had become less than she'd been, but because Eliza was a different size now than she'd been then, and the room had adjusted accordingly. Mrs. Connell, she said, I see you've landed somewhere, Agnes said. Her tone had the particular quality of a person who considers their cruelty a form of honesty. Though I understand it was a rather unconventional arrangement. Riker Boone, of all people. That man has been a burden to himself and everyone near him since his wife died. Frank Elders, behind the counter, said nothing. He was wrapping the salt in paper. He's been working hard land with 5 children, Eliza said. That's not a burden. That's just difficult. I heard his ranch is struggling, Agnes said. I suppose 2 struggling people deserve each other. Agnes, Dorothea Price said quietly, which was more than she'd done in the square. I don't mind struggling, Eliza said. Her voice was even. She was discovering with some interest that her voice was actually even, that she wasn't performing calm but had somehow arrived at it. I've been doing it my whole life. The difference now is I'm struggling towards something rather than away from something. She picked up the wrapped salt from the counter. I hope you're well, Mrs. Connell. She paid Frank Elders, collected the remainder of her supplies, and went to get May's boots from the cobbler's shop 2 doors down. She was almost to the cobbler's when she heard quick footsteps behind her. She turned, half expecting Agnes Connell again, and instead found Margaret Hollis, slightly breathless. Eliza, Margaret said, I wanted to... She stopped, pressed her lips together. I owe you an apology. For the square. Eliza looked at her. Margaret Hollis was in her 60s, a tall woman who had always seemed to her like someone in possession of more backbone than she usually deployed. She looked uncomfortable in the way of someone who has been sitting with a thing long enough that the sitting has become its own problem. You tried to stop it, Eliza said. I tried? And then I stopped trying, Margaret said, which is not the same as actually doing something. She held Eliza's gaze. I've thought about it many times since. I should have done more. Yes, Eliza said. She wasn't going to perform generosity she didn't entirely feel. You should have. Margaret nodded. She'd expected that, clearly. But you're here now saying it, Eliza said. That's worth something. She shifted the salt under her arm. I have to get boots for my daughter. Something moved through Margaret's face at the word daughter. Of course, she said. I hope things are well at the ranch. Better than they were, Eliza said. That's enough for now. She went to the cobbler's. She got the boots. Proper ones. Good leather, with room for May's feet to grow because they were always growing. She loaded everything onto the wagon and drove back out of Black Hollow in the early afternoon, and she felt the town fall away behind her the same way she had felt it fall away 7 months ago, but differently. Not with the numbness of someone leaving their only known world, but with the steady, purposeful feeling of someone returning to a better one. She was 2 miles from the ranch when the trouble found her. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, coming up fast behind her from the direction of a sidetrack she'd passed a half-mile back. She pulled the bay horse to the side of the road automatically and looked back, expecting to let someone pass in a hurry, and recognized, with a sinking in her stomach, the man on the horse, the scout, Clem Yardley. He lived 6 miles east of Morrow Creek on a piece of land that had always been in some dispute with its neighbors, and he was the kind of man who was difficult to characterize simply because his particular type of trouble came out only in specific conditions. He'd always been easy enough when sober, which he currently was not, even in the middle of the afternoon. He was a wide man with a red face and a manner that had always read to her. In the limited occasions she'd encountered him, as someone who required an audience for his worst behavior. Today there was no audience. That made it worse. He pulled up beside her wagon, and his horse crowded the bay in a way that made her grip the reins more firmly. Eliza Hart, he said. Mrs. Boone, she said, without raising her voice. Is that so? He said it with the smile of a man who finds a woman insisting on her name mildly funny. I heard you were at Boone's. Heard the whole story. Your daddy's selling you off in the square. He shook his head with the theatrical sympathy of someone not feeling any. That's a hard situation. A woman without options. I have quite a few options, she said. I'd like to exercise the one where I continue on the road. He moved his horse sideways. Not far. Just enough to suggest he wasn't through. What's the hurry? Boone keeping you busy up there? 5 children, all that work? He let the sentence trail in a way that put something unpleasant at the end of it without naming it. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. Her hands were steady on the reins. Inside, something had gone very cold and very alert. Not panic, but the heightened calm of someone who is calculating clearly. Move your horse, Mr. Yardley, she said. I'm just being friendly, he said. You were always going around town like you were better than everyone else, like being Chet Hart's daughter meant something, and it turned out you weren't even good for the one thing. That's enough, she said. The one thing a woman needs to be good for, and now you're out here playing house with a man who bought you because nobody else would. I said that's enough. Or what? He leaned forward in his saddle. You going to tell Boone, run back to the ranch? He smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. You're out here alone, Mrs. Boone. Nobody saw you leave town. Nobody's going to see us talking. She looked at him. She looked at him fully, without flinching, and she thought about what Riker had said. You don't have to stand still. And she reached under the wagon seat where she'd put the short-handled hatchet she used for the kindling at the ranch, and took it out and set it on her knee, not raising it, not threatening with it, just making its presence known. Yardley's smile thinned. Drive your horse somewhere else, she said, and her voice was so level it almost surprised her. I'm going home. A beat. 2. He was working through the calculation of whether she would actually use it, and she held his gaze and let him do his arithmetic, because the answer, she was fairly certain herself, was yes. He pulled his horse back, not gracefully, with the sullenness of a man who has been denied something and is going to be angry about it in private. He turned the horse without a word and went back the way he'd come. She sat for a moment after he'd gone, the hatchet still on her knee, the bay horse patient in the road. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking. Not badly, not in a way that would have shown if anyone was watching, but she could feel it. The aftermath of the alertness burning off, the body catching up to what the mind had already dealt with. She put the hatchet back under the seat and clicked to the bay horse and continued down the road toward Morrow Creek. She thought as she drove about what she'd said to him. I'm going home. She had not said, I'm going to the ranch, or I'm going back, or any of the provisional language she'd been using in her own head for months, the language that kept the possibility of impermanence as a kind of safety net. She had said home. She hadn't decided to say it. It had come out as the plain fact of things. Riker was at the fence by the lane when she came in. He heard the wagon and looked up and then looked more carefully, in the way of someone who has learned to read the specific quality of a person's posture from a distance. He was at the wagon before she'd fully stopped. What happened? He said. Not a question. She climbed down. She gave him the short version, Agnes Connell, which she watched him take with a tightening of his jaw, and then Yardley on the road, which she watched him take with something that went very still and very specific in his face. He blocked the road, Riker said. He moved when I asked him to. The second time or the first? She looked at him. The second. I had the hatchet. Something moved through Riker's face that was complicated enough that she couldn't read all of it at once. Anger, something that was probably relief, and beneath both of those, something more foundational that she was only beginning to know the shape of. He turned toward the barn. Where are you going? She said. To get the horse. Riker. Her voice stopped him. He turned back. He's gone, she said. He went back wherever he came from. If you ride out there now and find him, whatever happens will be worse than what already happened. He put you in a position, and I got myself out of it, she said, without your help, and I'm not saying that against you. I'm saying it as a fact. She held his gaze. He expected me to be scared and helpless, and I was neither. That's the end of it. Riker stood very still. She could see the effort of it, the held-down anger that wanted to go somewhere, the instinct to do something physical with the feeling. You're shaking, he said quietly. I know, she said. That's normal. That doesn't mean I was helpless. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon was quiet around them. The sound of the creek, a bird somewhere in the cottonwoods, the distant sound of the children in the yard behind the house. I should have gone to town, he said. You had the fence. The fence could have waited. Riker. She stepped closer to him. I need you to hear what I'm saying. I handled it. I'm not asking you to fix it after the fact. I'm telling you what happened so you know, because that's how we do things here. He looked at her. That quality in his face again, the complicated one. And then something in him settled. The way things settle when a person decides to be present in a moment rather than fighting with it. Agnes Connell, he said. What did she say? The usual, Eliza said. That you're a burden, and I'm a charity case, and we deserve each other. We do deserve each other, he said. It was so flat and so sincere that it took her a moment to catch up to it. That's not what she meant, Eliza said. I know, but it's still true. He looked at her with the directness that was she'd come to understand, the primary form his honesty took. I'm going to speak to Yardley. Not today, not in anger, but I'm going to speak to him. She considered that. All right. And Agnes Connell? He stopped. She has no claim on your time or your attention. She had no right to speak to you the way she did in any year, let alone this one. This one? Eliza said. He looked at her. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so simple and unannounced that she went completely still. His hand was rough from the fence work, warm from the afternoon, and it rested at her temple for just a moment before dropping back to his side. This year, he said, you've become... He seemed to be searching for the exact language and finding it inadequate. You've become something that wasn't here before, something the ranch needed, something the children needed. He paused. Something I needed. Eliza looked at him. Riker, she said. I know, he said. I'm not good at this. You're doing fine, she said. I've been meaning to say it for a while. He looked out at the lane, the hills, the land around him that he'd been trying to hold together for 4 years with varying success. I bought you in a square because I was desperate and because... He stopped. Because something about how you were standing there made me think you were a person who wasn't going to break. And I was right about that. And I've watched you for 7 months not break, and He looked back at her. I don't want you to be here because I paid for you. I want you to be here because you choose to be. The afternoon held its breath around them. I stayed, she said. That was a choice. I know. I'm saying I want you to know that whatever the beginning was, this is different now. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she'd said to Yardley on the road. I'm going home. She thought about May in the garden, and Daniel at the arithmetic table, and Nora holding a door, and all the small, unspectacular ways a life accretes into something worth the name. Riker, she said. I know. He looked at her. Something in his face went a little easier. Not fully easy. He wasn't a man who went fully easy, but easier. Like a thing that had been held too tightly for too long was finding a different grip. I'm going to take the bay horse out of harness, he said. I know, she said. I got May's boots. He almost smiled. It was the near smile she'd catalogued, the one that arrived and departed quickly and left you wondering if you'd seen it correctly. She's been walking on her toe, he said. I know, I got the good leather. He nodded and went to the bay horse, and Eliza went to the house with the supplies and the boots and the complicated full feeling of an afternoon that had been harder than she'd planned and had shown her several things about herself that she was going to need time to look at. She got to the kitchen before May found her. May came at a run from the direction of the parlor and stopped at her feet and looked up with those dark eyes. Did you get boots? She asked. I got boots. For me? For your feet specifically, yes. May held out a foot. Eliza sat down on the kitchen floor. Just sat down on the floor, because she was tired and it was there, and took the new boots from the bag and fitted them onto May's feet one at a time, lacing them carefully, and May stood very still for this, looking down at her feet with the concentration of someone receiving something important. Good? Eliza said. May walked 3 steps in a small circle. Good, she confirmed. Josie appeared in the doorway. Why are you on the floor? Because it's closer to the boots, Eliza said. Josie considered this. Can I sit on the floor too? You can do whatever you want in my general vicinity, Eliza said, which Josie accepted as a yes and sat down immediately next to her, shoulder to shoulder, and started telling her about the thing the barn cat had done that afternoon that was very interesting and which involved a frog. Eliza sat on the kitchen floor with Josie talking against her shoulder and May testing her new boots in circles on the wooden boards, and she thought about Clem Yardley on the road, about Agnes Connell in the supply store, about what it had felt like to say, I'm going home and mean it completely. She thought about Riker's hand at her temple, rough and warm and unrehearsed. She thought about the fact that she had driven into a town that had disposed of her, and driven back out of it with salt and boots and her dignity intact, and that waiting for her on the other side of that road had been 5 children who called her mama, and a man who had just told her, in the plain-spoken, imperfect way of him, that she was wanted. The kitchen was loud with Josie's frog story. May was now testing whether her new boots could make a different sound on the floor than the old ones. Outside, she could hear Riker coming in from the barn, and the sound of Sam's voice with his, something about the pasture fence they'd been working on, and Nora calling from the top of the stairs about dinner. Eliza sat on the floor a moment longer. Then she got up and started dinner. The evening was ordinary. That was what she loved about it. They ate around the table, all 7 of them, with the clatter and cross-conversation of a family that had stopped being careful around each other. Sam explained at length what was wrong with the north fence post and his theory for fixing it. Daniel disagreed with the theory. May demonstrated her boots twice by walking past the table with exaggerated footstep sounds. Josie finished the frog story with a conclusion that satisfied her, but left several questions open. Nora ate steadily and occasionally corrected the record on various points with the precision of a person who has been keeping accurate notes. Riker caught her eye once across the table. Just for a moment. She looked back at him. She didn't look away first. That night, after the dishes and the children and the slow settling of the house into its nighttime self, she stood on the porch in the cold spring dark for a few minutes, listening to the creek and the wind in the cottonwoods, and the particular quiet of a piece of land that has been worked and is resting. She thought about the weathered sign she'd seen on the lane coming in. It had been there since before Riker bought the property. An old sign, hand-lettered, that said, Morrow Creek in paint that had faded to near illegibility. She'd noticed it the first day and had thought it looked like something that needed replacing. She didn't think that anymore. She thought it looked like something that had been here long enough to have earned its fading, and would still be standing long after either of them could say. She went inside and latched the door against the cold and went to bed. She slept well, which she noted because she still didn't always, and she woke in the morning before the children, and she put on the fire and started coffee and looked out the east window at the hills coming up in the first light, and the thought she had was simple and complete. This is mine. Not owned, not given, not transacted in a square. Built, slow and imperfect and real, out of the material of actual days. The kind of mind that nobody can hand to you and nobody can take, because it lives inside rather than on paper. The coffee came up. She poured a cup and held it and watched the hills go from gray to gold. It was spring. There was work to do. The first sign was the creek. It happened so gradually that for a while no one named it out loud, as though naming it would make it more real than it already was. In April, the creek ran high with snowmelt, the way it always did, loud and brown-edged and reassuring. By May it had settled to its normal spring voice, but June came in different than the Junes Riker described from the years before. Drier, hotter at the edges, with a wind from the south that carried dust rather than moisture and left a fine grit on everything it touched. By the second week of June, the creek was lower than it should have been, running quiet over its stones with a patience that felt less like abundance than like careful rationing. Riker noticed it first. Of course he did. He'd been watching that creek for 4 years, reading it the way a person reads the face of someone they know well, cataloging its moods and what they meant for the pasture and the cattle and the kitchen garden and the simple daily question of whether there would be enough. He stood at the bank one morning in the early light and looked at the waterline and said nothing, which was how Eliza knew it was serious. He had a proportional relationship between words and worry. The more serious the thing, the fewer words there were for it. She came to stand beside him. She looked at the creek. She looked at the dark line on the bank stones where the water had been 2 weeks ago. How much lower? She asked. 6 inches, maybe 7? He picked up a stone from the bank and turned it in his hand. If it keeps going at this rate through July... He didn't finish the sentence. She did the math herself. She'd been learning the math of this land for 9 months, absorbing it the way you absorb a language when you live inside it, not through formal study but through daily necessity, through the accumulated small lessons of a place that has consequences. The kitchen garden will need to go to hand watering. The pasture is what I'm worried about. He set the stone down on the bank carefully, like placing something back where it belonged. If the grass goes, the cattle go with it. We don't have enough stored feed for a full summer, and I can't afford to buy more at current prices. She stood with him in the early morning quiet and thought about all of it. The banknote in Linfield that was current but barely, The fall cattle sale that was the load-bearing structure of their financial year, the 5 children in the house behind them who would eat through whatever the summer provided, regardless of what the summer was willing to give. "We irrigate what we can," she said, "starting now before it gets worse. The kitchen garden we hand water morning and night. The south pasture has the lower ground. We could try to direct some of the creek flow there before it drops further." "I've been thinking the same," he said. "And we cut the household spending to the bone. No supply runs unless absolutely necessary. I can stretch what we have." He looked at her. It was the look she'd learned to recognize, the one that still surprised her sometimes, even now, because it was the look of a man who is genuinely considering what someone else has said rather than waiting for his turn to speak. "The children are going to feel it," he said. "The children have felt harder things," she said. "They'll manage." He nodded slowly. She could see him assembling the plan in his head, fitting pieces together, the way he worked through things, methodically, without drama, with the focused practicality of someone who has learned that panic is a luxury the land doesn't extend to you. "All right," he said. "We start today." They started today. June was work. Not the ordinary work of the ranch, which was already considerable, but work layered on top of work. The extra hours of carrying water, of monitoring the creek level with a stick marked at intervals, of moving cattle to where the grass was still holding and then moving them again when it stopped holding, of mending the irrigation channel Riker dug along the south pasture edge with Sam's dogged assistance and Daniel's more reluctant but equally useful labor. The heat climbed. It climbed in the direct way of a summer that has decided to make itself understood. Not gradually, not with the usual seasonal politeness of warming by degrees, but in a single committed push that went from manageable to difficult in the span of a week and then stayed there. The sky was the bright white blue of drought weather, clear in a way that meant no relief was coming, the kind of clarity that would have been beautiful in another context, and in this one just meant more sun on the already thirsty ground. Eliza reorganized the kitchen around the heat. Earlier dinners, so the cooking wasn't done in the worst of the afternoon. Simpler food, things that required less wood and less time over the stove, cold meals when she could manage it, cooked meals when she couldn't avoid it but kept as brief as possible. She found herself recalibrating constantly, the way she'd recalibrated everything in her first months on the ranch, reading the situation for what it actually needed rather than what she'd planned for. The children adapted in their different ways. Sam threw himself into the irrigation work with Riker with a seriousness that reminded Eliza of his father. The same economy of movement, the same absence of complaint. Daniel worked too, but carried his frustration more visibly, muttering about the heat, about the unfairness of a summer that had decided to be this particular kind of summer, which Eliza thought was entirely reasonable and didn't try to manage out of him. Nora quietly took over more of the kitchen work without being asked, appearing at Eliza's elbow in the late afternoon with the beans already started or the bread already set to rise, and Eliza accepted this with the gratitude of someone who has learned that help offered freely is worth more than help extracted through obligation. Josie and May presented a different kind of challenge. They were hot and bored and too young to understand why they couldn't play in the creek the way they usually did. The water level had dropped enough that Eliza had restricted them from the bank, worried about the exposed rocks and the unpredictable current in a low creek, which was more treacherous than it looked. Josie protested this with the constitutional vigor she brought to all obstacles she considered unjust. May simply went to the bank and sat on it and stared at the water with the philosophical patience of a 4-year-old who has decided that proximity will eventually solve the problem. "You can't sit on the bank, May," Eliza said one afternoon, collecting her. "I wasn't in it," May said. "I know. Come back to the porch." "It's hot on the porch." "It's hot everywhere." May appeared to accept this as an accurate description of the universe. She took Eliza's hand and they walked back to the house. And Eliza felt the small, hot weight of that hand and thought, not for the first time that summer, whatever else this cost, it was worth it. She thought it the way you think things that are true in ways that go past argument. July was worse. The creek dropped to half its June level. The south pasture, which had held longer than Riker had hoped, started showing the pale patches of stressed grass that were the first stage of a process that ended badly if the rain didn't come. Riker moved the cattle again to the north pasture where the ground stayed marginally damper longer, and then watched that too with the tight-jawed focus of a man counting days in his head. Eliza watched him watch the land, She watched him the way she'd been watching him for 10 months now, with the particular attentiveness of someone who has learned another person's tells, who knows what the set of his shoulders means at breakfast, and what the quality of his silence means at dinner, and what it means when he comes in from the barn later than usual and sits at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes somewhere else entirely. "How many head can we sell early if we have to?" she asked him one evening. He looked up from the accounts. "I've been thinking about that." "I know. How many?" 20, maybe 25. Prices are low right now. Everyone in the county is in the same position. Nobody's buying cattle they have to feed through a dry summer." He rubbed the back of his neck. "If we sell at current prices, we cover the Linfield note and the fall supply run. Barely. And the rest of the herd holds until fall, if the north pasture holds, if I can keep them fed." He looked at the accounts, which she could see from across the table told a story that required careful reading. "I've been through dry summers before. Never this dry, this early." "What did you do before?" "Before I had fewer mouths to feed and different margins." He said it without accusation. It was just arithmetic. But she heard what was underneath it, the weight of responsibility for 5 children who had not asked to be born into a struggling year. "We're not going to lose the ranch," she said. He looked at her. "I mean that as an intention, not a guarantee," she said. "I understand the numbers. I'm saying I'm not going to watch this place go under without fighting it to the end." "I know you won't," he said. "What do you need me to do that I'm not doing?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. "The kitchen garden," he said. "If it keeps producing, it keeps us out of the supply store for the food budget through summer. That's real money." "I know. I'm watering it twice a day." "I saw the new irrigation ditch you put in along the east row." She'd done it 3 days ago, working in the early morning before the heat built, digging a narrow channel from the rain barrel along the fence line to the root vegetable bed. It was small and imperfect and required daily monitoring to keep from silting up, but it had taken 2 of the 6 hand-watering sessions per day off her load. "It's not elegant," she said. "It's working," he said. "That's better than elegant." She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her. It was 11 months since the square in Black Hollow, and the man across from her was both the same person who had walked across that square in silence and paid without negotiating, and someone she now knew in a way that had no parallel in her previous life. Known as, you know, the particular quality of a thing that has been tested and has held, not perfectly, not without showing its stress fractures, but held. "We're going to be all right," she said. "You can't know that," he said. "No," she said, "but I'm going to say it anyway. Go to sleep." He looked at her for a moment and then did something she'd seen him do perhaps a dozen times in the months she'd been here. He laughed, brief and low, more exhale than sound, the laugh of a man who finds the world genuinely surprising on occasion. He closed the accounts and went to bed. She sat alone at the table and thought about what she'd said. She couldn't know it. She'd said it anyway because she understood something about hard times that she'd learned the hard way herself. What you tell yourself in the worst of it is part of how you get through it. And telling yourself the worst outcome as though it's inevitable is not honesty. It's surrender dressed up as realism. She was not going to surrender. She decided that a long time ago, in a smaller and more private context, sitting in a room in her father's house trying to figure out what kind of person she was going to be when nobody was watching. She'd decided then, with nobody to tell and nothing to prove it against. And she was deciding it again now with more at stake and more to lose. And that made it somehow easier rather than harder. She went to the kitchen garden in the early morning dark and watered it and went to bed for a few hours, and then got up and started the day. The Last Chance Garden was Eliza's idea, and it started from desperation, which is where most good ideas actually come from if you're honest about it. The kitchen garden was holding, barely, with the twice-daily watering and the irrigation channel, but it wasn't enough to carry them through a full drought summer. They needed more. The problem was the ground. The soil on the east side of the house, which was the only place with reasonable sun exposure that wasn't already in use, had been described by Riker as dead ground. Compacted hard pan baked further by the drought, the kind of soil that a shovel bounces off of and that nothing has grown in for years. She looked at it one July afternoon while the heat pressed down from a white sky, and she thought about the kitchen garden in March, which had also been dead ground by any reasonable assessment, and what patience and amendment and obstinate daily effort had produced from it. She got the shovel. Nora found her an hour later, working the east ground with the kind of focused intensity that in Eliza usually signaled either deep anger or deep determination. They looked similar from the outside. "What are you doing?" Nora asked. "Breaking ground." Nora looked at the soil. She picked up a clod of it and let it fall, and it landed hard and whole, barely crumbling. "Papa says nothing grows here." "Papa is probably right," Eliza said. "I'm going to try anyway." A pause. "Can I help?" "Get the other shovel from the shed." Nora got the shovel. They worked through the afternoon in the heat, which was miserable, and Eliza didn't pretend otherwise. They were sweating through their clothes by mid-morning, stopping to drink water, not talking much because the work required too much of them for conversation. But Nora stayed. She had her father's quality of commitment. Once she'd decided to do a thing, she did it without looking for the exit. By evening, they had broken maybe 12 feet of ground. It was a beginning. It was barely a beginning. Riker came and looked at it as the sun went down. "You're going to plant this?" he said. "Fast growers," Eliza said. "Radishes, lettuce, more beans. Things that can come up in 3 weeks if the soil will let them." She looked at the broken ground. "I found the compost pile behind the barn. If we amend this soil properly, that'll take days." "I have days." He stood looking at the ground she'd broken. She waited. "I'll move the compost in the morning," he said. "I can do it." "You've done enough today." He said it without softness or sentiment, just as a plain observation. "I'll move the compost." He did. He moved it the next morning before the heat built, 2 full barrow loads that he worked into the broken ground, and she was out there with him, and Daniel came out after breakfast and picked up a shovel without being asked and worked beside his father, and by noon they had something that looked, if you were willing to be optimistic, like actual planting ground. She put seeds in that afternoon. They were the last of the seeds from the pantry tin she'd found in her first week, Clara Boone's seeds, still in their original paper packets, with the variety and date written in careful handwriting. She'd been saving them, not entirely knowing why, and now she opened each packet carefully and planted what it held. There was no guarantee. She understood that. The soil was marginal, the heat was extreme, the water supply was a daily negotiation. She planted anyway because that was the answer she kept arriving at. You do the thing that might work, fully and without reservation, and you let the outcome be what it is. She watered the bed that evening and looked at the bare ground. "Are they going to grow?" May asked beside her. "I don't know," Eliza said. "But you planted them anyway." "That's how it works," Eliza said. "You plant them and wait and see." May considered this. Then she crouched down and patted the soil gently with her palm, the way she'd seen Eliza do. An instinctive gesture of encouragement, as if the seeds needed to know someone was rooting for them. Eliza watched her and felt something in her chest that was too large to look at directly. The seedlings came up on the 9th day. Eliza was there when they emerged. She went to the garden before dawn, as she always did, and crouched in the low light and looked, and there they were, tiny green hooks pushing up through the amended ground, the same absurd defiant gesture she'd seen from the first bean seedling in March, saying, not yet beaten. She sat back on her heels and breathed. Then she got up and went to get the water. It was the second week of August when Riker collapsed. He'd been pushing past his limits for 6 weeks by then, and she'd known it and had said so twice. And he'd heard her and agreed and kept pushing past his limits anyway, because the work didn't stop being necessary because the person doing it was exhausted. That was the math of a drought summer on a ranch with a banknote, and they had both understood it going in. She found him in the barn, in the afternoon when she'd come looking because he hadn't come in for the midday meal, which he didn't miss without reason. He was sitting against the far stall wall with his legs out and his head back and his color wrong. She knelt beside him immediately. She put her hand on his forehead and felt what she'd been afraid she would feel. "How long have you had the fever?" she said. His eyes opened. They were bright and slightly unfocused. "Since morning," he said. "I thought I could work through it." "Of course you did," she said, which was as close to scolding as she was going to get right now. "Can you walk if I help you?" "I can walk by myself." "Humor me." He walked with her arm under his, which he didn't require and accepted without comment. She got him to the house and into bed, and sent Nora, who had taken one look at her father's face and gone pale but steady, which was what Eliza had expected from her, to get cool water and the clean rags from the kitchen. The fever was serious, but not catastrophic. She recognized the kind that comes from a body that has been running too hard for too long in summer heat and has run out of reserves. Not the sudden violent fever of an illness, but the slow accumulated fever of depletion. It needed rest, fluids, and time, and it was going to be a few days at minimum. Riker did not take this information well. "The North Pasture check is tomorrow," he said, from the bed, where she had just made it very clear he was staying. "Sam can do the pasture check." "Sam is 12. Sam has been doing the cattle check with you for 6 months. He knows what to look for." She was wringing out a cloth. "He can come get me if anything needs a decision. The irrigation channel on the south side needs—" "I know what the irrigation channel needs. I've been looking at it every morning. The cattle in the back pasture haven't been moved in." "Riker." She put the cloth on his forehead. He stopped talking. She looked at him steadily. "I have been learning this ranch for 11 months. I know the cattle. I know the pastures. I know the irrigation channels, and the north fence, and the creek levels, and which of the animals is doing well, and which needs watching." She held his gaze. "You are not going to lose everything because you took 3 days to recover from a fever. The ranch will be here. I will be here. Now stop talking and drink this water." He drank the water. He looked at her with an expression she recognized from the first months. The look of someone recalculating something he thought he'd already calculated. "You sound very certain," he said. "I am certain," she said, "of some things." "Which things?" She took the cup back and refilled it from the pitcher. "That you're going to be all right. That the children are capable of more than you give them credit for. That I'm not going to let this ranch go under while you're lying in bed with a fever." She handed him the cup. "Those things." He drank again. His eyes were closing. The fever pulling him down into the heavy sleep of someone whose body has simply decided it's done for now. "Eliza," he said. "Rest," she said. He seemed to be trying to say something and not finding the shape of it. She waited. "I'm glad I walked across that square," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "So am I," she said. "Sleep." He slept. She ran the ranch for 4 days with Nora beside her and Sam doing the cattle work, and Daniel managing the irrigation with a competence that he probably didn't fully recognize in himself, and Josie and May doing whatever small useful tasks could be found for them. And she held it together through those 4 days with the same quality of determination she'd brought to everything on this place. Not gracefully, not perfectly, with wrong turns and recalculations, and one afternoon where she sat on the barn floor for 10 minutes because she was so tired she needed to sit somewhere and the barn was where she happened to be. She sat there and breathed and then got up and went back to work. On the 3rd day, she went to the Last Chance garden in the early morning and found the beans up 6 inches. The radishes had spread into a proper row. The lettuce was thin but real, the kind of green that means it intends to keep going. She stood in the summer heat and looked at the growing things in the dead ground. She thought about seeds, about what it means to put something in the ground when the conditions are wrong, and the odds are against you, and you do it anyway, not because you're naive about the odds, but because the alternative is to not plant at all, and a ground with nothing in it is certain to produce exactly that. She thought about a man walking across a square in Black Hollow and not saying anything, just paying. She thought about 5 children who had needed something she hadn't known she had to give, and had taken it from her anyway through the simple, persistent pressure of being alive and present and hers. She went in to check on Riker. He was sitting up. His color was better. Not right, but better. The fever down from where it had been. His eyes clear rather than bright with the particular clarity of illness. "How's the garden?" he asked. "The Last Chance garden has beans up 6 inches, she said. He looked at her. Something in his face went quiet and full at the same time. "That ground's been dead for years," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit up and eat something." She brought him broth and sat in the chair beside the bed while he ate, and he ate slowly, and not much, but he ate, and the afternoon light came through the window at the particular angle it had in August, and lay across the floor in a long, warm rectangle. And outside she could hear Sam's voice from the direction of the north pasture, and Josie explaining something at length to May on the porch and the creek, quieter now than it had been in April, but still there, still running. The beans are going to make it, she said. You sound sure. I am sure. The soil was dead. The soil was hard, she said. That's not the same thing. He handed her the empty bowl. He lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling and was quiet for a long time. Eliza, he said. I'm here. I know. A pause. I just wanted to say it. She set the bowl on the side table. She looked at this man, this difficult, reserved, genuinely good man who had walked across a square 11 months ago and changed both their lives without making a single speech about it. When you're better, she said, I want to talk about the banknote. When I'm better, he agreed, and the fall cattle sale. Yes. And the fence on the south side. Eliza. What? Can we do that tomorrow? She looked at him. He was watching her with the almost smile that still came and went too quickly, and she thought, there it is. The thing that had been building for 11 months, not a single moment, but all the moments stacked and solid, forming something load-bearing. Tomorrow, she said. He closed his eyes. She sat in the chair beside the bed for another half hour, listening to his breathing even out into sleep, listening to the children and the creek and the ranch doing what it did, living, imperfectly, forward. The beans were 6 inches tall in dead ground. The cattle were in the north pasture. The creek was low but running. The children were loud on the porch. And Morrow Creek Ranch was still standing. That was enough for today. The rains came in September, not dramatically, not the redemptive downpour of a story that has decided to be merciful, but in the slow, tentative way of weather that is testing whether it is welcome. A gray morning, a smell in the air that Eliza had almost forgotten over the long white summer, and then a rain that started as mist and built over 2 days into something real, something that soaked into the cracked ground and stayed there rather than running off the hardpan the way the brief July storms had. The creek rose 6 inches in 3 days. The north pasture, which had been holding by the thinnest margin of its remaining grass, began almost immediately to show the faint return of green at the base of the dry stalks. Riker stood on the porch in the rain the second morning and did not say anything for a long time. Eliza stood beside him. She let the quiet be what it was. The south pasture is going to need reseeding, he said finally. I know. Spring project. I know. He looked at the creek line, at the cottonwoods that had gone thin and slightly desperate-looking through August and were already, in the rain, beginning to recover some quality of themselves. The beans, he said. Still going, she said. I checked this morning. He nodded. The last chance garden had, against the honest odds, produced. Not abundantly. The yields were modest, the plants smaller than they should have been. The whole enterprise marked by the conditions it had grown through. But it had produced. Beans, radishes, enough lettuce to supplement the table through the worst of August, and from Clara's seed packets, against all reasonable expectation, a row of carrots that had come up late and thin and sweet in the way that carrots grown in difficult soil sometimes are, concentrating their sugars the way living things sometimes concentrate what they have when there isn't enough to be generous with. The fall cattle sale went better than the numbers had suggested it would. It went better because of a decision Eliza had pushed for in the weeks after Riker recovered from the fever. The decision to sell 20 head early at reduced prices to cover the Linfield note completely before the fall rather than carrying it to the wire. He'd resisted it, not wrongly, because selling early in a drought year meant selling low. She'd sat across from him at the kitchen table with the account book open between them and made the case. The interest on the note was eating margin they didn't have, and carrying debt through an uncertain fall was a risk that the bank benefited from more than they did. We sell the 20, clear the note, and we own this land outright, she said. We own it at a loss, he said. We own it. That's different from owing it. She held his gaze. A bank can be patient when it serves the bank. Right now, carrying the note serves the bank. Clearing it serves us. He looked at the numbers for a long time. You're not wrong, he said. I know. You don't have to say it like that. I know that too, she said, and he looked at her with the near smile and picked up the pen. The note was paid in August. Morrow Creek Ranch, all 340 acres of it, including the struggling pasture and the dead ground that wasn't, and the creek that ran low but ran, belonged to Riker and Eliza Boone without condition or encumbrance, which was a thing she turned over in her mind for several days after it was done, finding it different every time she looked at it. They were married properly in October, 14 months after the square in Black Hollow. Not a large event. The Hollis family from town, two neighboring ranching families who had become something like friends over the past year, the 5 children scrubbed and dressed and varying in their levels of ceremony tolerance. Josie was enthusiastically in favor of the whole enterprise and had opinions about flowers. May wore her good boots and held Eliza's hand during the vows with the gravity of someone who considers this a formal occasion requiring her personal endorsement. Sam stood straight and tried to look like a man who has been to many weddings. Nora cried once, briefly, and then looked at the sky until she had stopped, and Eliza did not mention it. Daniel stood beside his father as a witness, at 14, with a seriousness in his face that was no longer the defensive seriousness of a boy waiting for the next loss, but something quieter and more settled. When it was done and they were walking back to the house for the meal, he fell into step beside Eliza. "You were always going to stay," he said. Not a question. "Were you sure of that?" she asked. He thought about it. "By November," he said, "after I called you. After the first time. I'd been watching and I decided." A pause. "Papa took longer." "Your father is careful," she said. "He was scared," Daniel said, with the blunt accuracy of a 14-year-old who has observed something clearly and sees no reason not to say it. "After Mama, he thought if he stopped, tried again. He didn't want something and then lose it again." Eliza walked for a moment without answering. "He told you that?" she said. "He didn't have to," Daniel said. "I'm his son." She looked at this boy, this young man, really, because he was old enough now that the word fit, even if it still surprised her, and felt the particular complicated love of someone who has been chosen by a person who had very good reasons not to choose anyone. "You're a good son," she said. He looked straight ahead. "I know," he said, which was so purely Daniel that she laughed, and after a moment he did too, and they walked back to the house together in the October light with the sound of the children and the guests ahead of them, and the ranch spread out on all sides. A working, imperfect, living piece of land that had cost everything and been worth it. The years that followed Morrow Creek were not easy, because nothing on the frontier was easy, and anyone who told you otherwise was either lying or hadn't been there long enough to find out. There were good years and bad years, and years that were simply years, ordinary in the way that constitutes most of an actual life, full of the unremarkable days that don't make for stories but make for something more durable, a rhythm, a way of being, the slow accumulation of a shared life. The drought of that first terrible summer was not the last drought. There were 2 more in the following decade, neither as bad, one nearly as bad, and they got through both with the methods and the stubbornness that the first one had built into them. The banknote was never taken out again. Eliza made certain of that, not through rigidity but through the same clear-eyed attention to the numbers that had cleared it in the first place, a running calibration of what they had against what they needed, with enough margin held back that a bad season didn't become a catastrophic one. The ranch expanded slowly, in the careful way of people who have learned to be skeptical of rapid growth because they understand what rapid loss looks like. A second pasture purchased from the neighboring Calloway property when old Edgar Calloway died without heirs and the land went to auction. A small herd of dairy cattle added in the 4th year, Eliza's idea, which took 2 seasons to pay for itself and then became one of the steadiest income lines they had. A proper irrigation system, built over one summer by Riker and Daniel and Sam and 2 hired hands, that replaced the hand watering and the improvised channels and would survive long after all of them. The children grew. That was in its own way the most extraordinary thing, the plain fact of it, the speed and totality of it, the way children grow through you rather than simply near you, incorporating the things you've given them so completely that you can no longer see the seams. Sam became the rancher Eliza had seen the outline of in that 8-year-old boy who stood near the back door keeping his options open. He had his father's solidity and something of Eliza's practicality, and he understood cattle the way some people understand weather, not through calculation, but through a kind of continuous reading that operated beneath thought. He stayed on the ranch. That was his choice, made at 17 with a completeness that required no revisiting, and Riker received it with more emotion than he showed, which Eliza knew because she knew him. Nora left at 19, which surprised no one who had watched her. She went to teach in a school 3 towns over, a position she'd written to inquire about with the same directness she brought to everything, and she taught there for 5 years before writing again to a school in Linfield that was looking for someone to run it. She ran it for 23 years. She came home to Morrow Creek every Christmas without fail, and every Christmas she and Eliza sat at the kitchen table after the children and eventually grandchildren were in bed and talked with the easy honesty of 2 people who have always told each other the truth. "You shaped me," Nora told her on one of those evenings, when they were both older and the ranch had changed in a dozen ways and stayed the same in 100 more. "Your mother shaped you," Eliza said. "Both," Nora said. "That's allowed." Daniel became a lawyer, which astonished the town of Black Hollow and no one at Morrow Creek. He had always had the mind for it, the precision, the memory for detail, the willingness to argue a position not because he enjoyed conflict, but because he believed accuracy mattered enough to fight for. He studied in Linfield and then in a city to the east, and he came back to the region with his education and his wife, a woman named Harriet, who had the same quality of direct gaze that Eliza had long associated with people worth knowing. And he practiced in Linfield, close enough to come home for harvests and holidays, far enough to make his own life on his own terms. He handled the legal situation with Clem Yardley. Years later, when Yardley's claim that he had some right to the access road across the east edge of Morrow Creek came to a formal dispute, Daniel filed the response himself, his parents' names on the case, and he won it so completely that Yardley's family never raised the question again. Daniel did not charge them for his time. When Riker tried to press the point, Daniel said simply that some work was personal, and that was the end of the discussion. Josie went 4 directions before finding her one. She tried teaching like Nora, didn't like it. Tried working at the dry goods store in Black Hollow, liked the people, didn't like the indoors. Spent 2 years on a ranch to the north that was run by a family of women who had survived their own version of hard times and built something remarkable out of it, which Eliza thought was exactly the right place for Josie to spend 2 years. She came back at 23 with a man named Peter Aldis, who was quiet in all the ways Josie wasn't, and who had the particular gift of genuine listeners. He made Josie feel worth hearing, which was all she'd ever needed from anyone, which Eliza recognized immediately and loved him for. May stayed closest. She married a man from the valley, a carpenter named Thomas Reeve, and they built a house on the far edge of the Morrow Creek property where the cottonwoods grew thickest along the creek. And they had 3 children, and May's oldest daughter had her father's dark eyes, and her grandmother Eliza's habit of going to the kitchen garden in the early morning before anyone else was up. Eliza watched this and felt something that was too large and too specific for any single word. Riker watched it with her most mornings, from the porch. They had grown old on Morrow Creek in the way of people who have been genuinely lucky in the only way that counts. Not lucky in the absence of difficulty, but lucky in having found the thing worth working for. The thing that makes the difficulty a cost you accept rather than a price you resent. He was gray now, his face cut deeper by the years of weather, his hands unchanged in their roughness and their capability. She was gray too, and had stopped minding it the way she'd stopped minding a lot of things that had seemed important to mind when she was younger. They did not talk more than they always had. That was one of the truths about their marriage that she had come to regard as a gift rather than a lack. They had never needed to fill silence to make it comfortable, which meant that the silences between them had always been a form of companionship rather than its absence. But they talked enough. It was an evening in late spring, 22 years after the day Riker had walked across the square in Black Hollow, when the men from the railroad came. There were 3 of them, arriving in a hired buggy from Linfield, dressed in the manner of men who represent money, not extravagantly, but with the particular quality of clothing that has never needed to be practical. They had sent a letter 2 weeks previous, politely worded, requesting a meeting. Riker had shown Eliza the letter the morning it arrived. She had read it twice and set it on the table. "They want to buy the ranch," she said. "The letter says they want to discuss it." "The letter is polite. What they want is to buy the ranch." She looked at him. "The rail line they're planning goes through the valley. We're in the path of it, or close enough that they need either our land or our cooperation." He looked at the letter. "They're offering to discuss terms." "They'll offer a lot of money," she said. "The railroad always has a lot of money." "Does it matter how much?" he asked. He said it without inflection, the way he asked things he already had a position on, but wanted to hear her position first. She looked at him. She looked out the kitchen window at the hills that she had watched change color with the seasons for 22 years, at the cottonwoods along the creek, at the garden that was in its spring state. Not the struggling plot of that first March, but something generous and established, with fruit trees now along the east side and raised beds where the last chance garden had been, a thing that had grown into abundance through the patient accumulation of good years. She looked at all of it. "No," she said. "It doesn't matter how much." He nodded once. "Then we know what we're going to say." "We should hear them out," she said. "It's the decent thing, and Daniel would want us to understand the offer before we decline it." "We can hear them out," he said, "and then decline it." She almost smiled. "Yes." The three men came on a Thursday. Eliza made coffee and set out what the kitchen had, because whatever else was happening, guests were guests. She sat at the table with Riker, which was not the arrangement the men had expected. She could see it in the slight recalibration of their posture, the way they had come prepared for a meeting with the rancher and were adjusting to a meeting with the rancher and his wife, who appeared to be a participant rather than a presence. The lead man's name was Garfield Pruitt. He was perhaps 50, with a practiced pleasantness that was not insincere exactly, but was clearly a tool he'd developed for professional use. He laid out the offer clearly and competently. The railroad needed an easement through the valley. The Morrow Creek property was ideally positioned. They were prepared to offer a purchase price that he named, or alternatively, an easement fee that he named, both of which were significant numbers. Riker listened to all of it without expression. "We've been on this land for 22 years, he said when Pruitt had finished. "I understand," Pruitt said. "That's why we're here in person rather than through correspondence. We respect the history of the property. We cleared a banknote on this land in the first year," Riker said. "We got through a drought that should have taken us. We built the irrigation system and the dairy operation and the east pasture fencing and the—" He stopped. He looked at Eliza briefly and then back at Pruitt. "We built everything you see here. It took 20 years. The offer reflects that investment," Pruitt said. "No offer can reflect that investment," Eliza said. Her voice was even. Pruitt looked at her with the attention of someone recalibrating again. "What you can put a number on is the land and the improvements. What you can't put a number on is what it costs to make it what it is." She held his gaze. "We're not selling." Pruitt looked at Riker. "My wife speaks for both of us," Riker said. Pruitt set down his cup. He looked like a man working through options, calculating what argument might still be available. "The railroad is going to come through this valley," he said, "whether through your land or around it. Around it adds considerably to the route and the cost, which means the company will need to pursue other arrangements." "That sounds like a company problem," Eliza said. "It may become a legal matter," Pruitt said carefully. "My son is a lawyer," Eliza said. "A good one. He'll know what to do with a legal matter." A pause. The second railroad man was looking at his hat. The third was looking at the window. Pruitt smiled. The professional smile, held past its usual limits. "I appreciate your position," he said. "I'll convey it to the company." "I'd appreciate that," Eliza said. They left the way they'd come. Eliza and Riker sat at the table after the sound of the buggy had faded down the lane, with the coffee cups between them and the spring afternoon coming through the window. "Legal matter," Riker said. "Daniel will handle it," she said. "I know he will." He turned his cup. The old habit, unchanged in 22 years. "Was I supposed to say more?" "You said what needed saying. It felt like you did most of the talking." "You said my wife speaks for both of us," she said. "That's not a small thing to say to a man like that." He looked at her. She looked back at him. 22 years and she still found things to learn in his face, new arrangements of familiar lines, new qualities in the familiar gray-green eyes. "We should write to Daniel tonight," he said. "I already have a draft," she said. He laughed. The full laugh, not the near one. She still cataloged the difference, still found the full one remarkable in its rarity and its realness. "Of course you do," he said. The railroad pursued its legal avenue, and Daniel met it with complete adequacy, and the matter was settled 18 months later with an easement limited to the far northern edge of the property, far from the house and the pastures and the creek, and the terms of it were such that the ranch was compensated fairly and inconvenienced minimally, which was not nothing and was not everything anyone wanted, and was, like most real outcomes, a thing that required acceptance rather than celebration. But Morrow Creek stayed Morrow Creek. The sign at the lane, the old hand-lettered one, faded to near illegibility when Eliza had first arrived, which Riker had repainted in the 5th year, and which had faded again and been repainted again by Sam in the 15th, was replaced, the spring after the railroad negotiation, with a new sign. Eliza made it herself, over several evenings at the kitchen table, a piece of good hardwood that she sanded and sealed against the weather. She painted Morrow Creek on it in the letters she'd looked at for 22 years, and beneath it, smaller, in the plain steady hand she'd always had, not for sale. Riker saw it when she brought it out to the lane post. He stood looking at it for a moment. "That's permanent," he said. "That's the idea," she said. He took the hammer from her hand and drove the sign into its post himself, and when it was done he stood back and looked at it, and she stood beside him, and the sign stood in the spring morning in the particular way of things that intend to outlast the people who made them. "You know what I've been thinking about," he said. "Tell me." "That Thursday, in the square." He was still looking at the sign. "I almost didn't go." She turned to look at him. "I'd heard about it," he said. "Someone in town mentioned it the day before. That Chet Hart was going to put his daughter in the square in the morning. And I thought—" He paused. "I thought it was none of my concern. I had enough concerns. 5 children, and a failing ranch, and a grief I hadn't figured out what to do with. I didn't need another concern." "What changed?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I kept thinking about it through the night, about what it must be like to be the person standing there." He looked at her. "I thought, I know what it is to feel like no one is going to come. I felt that. And if someone had come for me in that moment, what would that have been worth?" She looked at him for a long time. "So you came," she said. "I came," he said. "And I walked across the square and I looked at you and I thought, there's a person who is not going to break. And I was right." "You didn't know that," she said. "You couldn't have known that from looking at someone." "No," he said. "But I believed it. And I've found in my life that what you believe about a person can matter almost as much as what's true, because people tend to become what you believe they can be, if the belief is honest." She stood with that. "That's the most I've ever heard you say at once," she said. "I've been working up to it for 22 years, he said. She took his hand. His hand was the same as it had always been, rough, warm, capable. She held it the way May had held hers in the kitchen garden on that October morning, a long time ago, with the full weight of intention. "I have something to tell you," she said. "I've known it for a while, and I've been working out how to say it." He waited. He was still good at waiting. "I was nothing when I came here," he said. She said, "I know that's a strong word, and I don't use it to be dramatic. I mean it in the technical sense. I had been told by enough people for long enough that I had no value, that I'd started to believe the arithmetic. I was nothing in the way of someone who has been subtracted down to 0. She looked at the sign. "And then I came here. And the children needed things I turned out to be capable of. And the land needed things I turned out to be capable of. And you—" She stopped. "I needed things," he said quietly. "You needed things," she said. "And I turned out to be capable of those too. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, I stopped being nothing. And became this." She gestured, a small gesture, encompassing the sign and the lane and the ranch behind them, and the hills and the creek. "And I need you to know that it wasn't the place that did it. It wasn't the ranch. It was the fact that someone needed me honestly and let me meet that need without requiring me to be someone other than who I am." She looked at him. "You did that. Without planning to, just by needing help and not being ashamed to need it." Riker was very still. "I'm not good at receiving that," he said. "I know," she said. "Receive it anyway." He looked at the sign. He looked at her. "All right," he said. They walked back to the house together in the spring morning, his hand in hers, the sign standing at the lane behind them. May was visible in the garden with her oldest girl, who was 4 and already showing the same instinct toward the early morning that had always been Eliza's. The sound of Sam in the barn and his eldest son's voice with him, both of them talking through something with the focused shorthand of people who work together well enough to share a language. Inside, there would be breakfast to make, and after breakfast, the accounts to review because the spring supply run needed planning, and after that, a fence section on the north boundary that Sam had flagged, and after that, all the ordinary, demanding, unremarkable things that constituted a Thursday at Morrow Creek Ranch. Eliza had learned over 22 years that this was the thing nobody tells you about a life that has turned out well. It looks, from the inside, exactly like a life that is simply continuing. The days do not feel significant. The work does not feel historic. You make the breakfast and review the accounts and ride out to look at the fence, and it is only later, sometimes much later, sometimes only when you are very still and the light is a certain way and the creek is doing what it does and the people you love are within earshot, that you understand you have been living inside something worth living inside of. You cannot know that while you are in it. You can only keep going and trust that the going is taking you somewhere and do the work in front of you with whatever you have. Eliza had come to Morrow Creek with a canvas bag and a broken hairbrush and a book of poems she'd read until the pages went soft. She'd come with the understanding, installed in her by people who should have known better, that she was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. What she'd found out, in the long, imperfect education of 22 years, was this: you don't become who you are by being seen correctly from the beginning. You become who you are in the daily choices. To plant the seed in the dead ground, to stay at the bedside through the long night, to stand in the road with your hatchet on your knee and refuse to be moved, to say, "I'm going home," and mean it from the center of yourself. Nobody gives you that. Nobody can take it either. She went inside. She put the coffee on. She listened to the ranch wake up around her. May's voice from the garden, Sam's from the barn, Riker's boots on the porch steps, the sound of her granddaughter's footsteps running toward the back door. The door opened, small arms around her waist. A face turned up to her. "Can I help?" May's oldest girl asked. "Get the cups," Eliza said. The girl went for the cups. Eliza stood at the stove in the spring morning in the kitchen she had learned by living in it, on the land she had earned by working it, in the life she had built from nothing by refusing, daily and without ceremony, to believe it was nothing. The coffee came up. Outside the lane, in the spring light, the sign stood. It would stand for a long time after that. Not for sale, which meant not for any price, not to any railroad, not to any notion that what a person is worth can be calculated in a square on a Thursday morning in a dry summer while 40 people watch and say nothing. It meant, this was made from the hardest materials available, and it holds, and it is ours, and we are staying. It meant everything it needed to mean.